Freaks is one of the strangest movies ever made by an American studio.
What I see in the movie Freaks was probably one of the most authentic portrayals of a sideshow.
Freaks is a look into the lives of these sideshow performers. It's basically a soap opera set in a sideshow.
Freaks is not a documentary. It is a Hollywood film, and it is painted in very broad strokes. And yet, it still does show the human side of that which, at first glance, is very inhuman. That is the sideshow, the circus, the carnival sideshow freaks.
When I was a kid, I wasn't crazy about it because it put us in a bad light.
It's an undiscovered masterpiece.
Freaks was produced by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in the late part of 1931, and it was an attempt to capitalize on the big success other studios were having with horror films, like Dracula and Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This was a brand new kind of Hollywood entertainment. There had been frightening characters in the silent days, but no supernatural monsters, and certainly no real physical anomalies appearing on screen.
I think the great thing about the movie Freaks is the approach that Todd Browning took. What people might not know is that Todd Browning had a background. Early in his career, he worked in sideshows and on carnivals and circuses and things like that.
Todd Browning had done many pictures with Lon Chaney Sr., the man of 1,000 faces, and they specialized in films about physical deformity and mutilation. They had worked together on one of MGM's biggest hits of the 1920s. It was called The Unholy Three, and it was based on a novel by Todd Robbins, and it had a very outlandish premise. It was about three criminals, kind of a strongman giant, and a ventriloquist, and a midget who was really quite a nasty little thug, masqueraded himself as a baby. He was originally going to direct The Hunchback of Notre Dame at Universal with Lon Chaney, but was dumped from it after his problems became too much to handle. Irving Thalberg, before he came to MGM, was at Universal, and he had spearheaded that picture. And he seemed to have a special interest himself in these themes about physical abnormality and disability. He was kind of a frail, almost sickly man himself. So it was really a three-way fascination. Chaney was fascinated with these kinds of characters, Browning loved the material, and Thalberg also seemed to take a personal interest. So they created some of the strangest movies ever to come out of Hollywood. Harry Earls, who played the midget in The Unholy Three, came to Browning apparently with a copy of a short story that Todd Robbins, who had done The Unholy Three, had written. It was called Spurs.
And it was it's a much darker story than the movie Freaks actually is. No one comes out of it cleanly because the dwarf comes off very dark, very egotistical, mad at the world. The performer and her lover, who happens to be a bareback rider, not a strong man in the story, it's a bareback rider, come off as scheming and thinking that the dwarf will be an easy mark, someone that they can get his money and then run off together and have a wonderful life. And the other sideshow freaks in the story come off as very self-centered and not really good people. And no one is clean in that story.
There weren't too many properties, of course, for a performer like Earls, who didn't make his living primarily in movies. So he was keenly interested in this, and it was purchased as a property for Lon Chaney. And it never came about. It may have been a little too much like some of the other pictures Chaney was making. But it was clear that Browning really wanted to push the envelope even further, and with Freaks, for the first time, he got to populate a film with physical spectacles that Lon Chaney never could have approximated in his lifetime. And Chaney became sick and died of lung cancer in 1930. And by that time, Browning had left MGM temporarily. He directed Dracula at Universal and a couple of other pictures. But he came back to MGM, and the studio was eager to capitalize on this brand new genre, the talking horror movie. And the idea, apparently, was to create the most horrifying movie that had ever been done. Todd Browning would now top Dracula with the ultimate horror film. And there's a story that when the screenwriter brought the script to Irving Thalberg and he read it, he kind of dropped his head into his hands and said, "Well, I asked for something horrible, and I guess I got it." Freaks was really Browning's obsession, I think. When he returned to MGM, he was offered the chance to do a big-budget costume drama, the famous detective story, Arsène Lupin, that would have brought the Barrymore brothers together for the first time. And he turned it down. He really wanted to do another circus picture.
I came to the movie Freaks because of my background in magic and sideshow and things like that. And sooner or later, when you get involved in this end of show business, the movie Freaks comes up because it is a very important film.
And I think that's the charm of the film. It more attempted to give you the back of the stage view of what was really going on rather than the audience's conception of what was happening and the grubbiness of a lot of the industry.
He didn't realize his point of view was not what the average man or certainly the executives at MGM were thinking when they agreed to this film. And it's just of a time when there was still an adventurous spirit in Hollywood.
A lot of the executives at MGM were not excited about Spurs as a film, especially because they no longer had a performer like Lon Chaney to anchor it. Chaney was one of the biggest bankable superstars of the silent era. But Browning nonetheless wanted to do it. The casting process doesn't seem to have gone really smoothly. Irving Thalberg first wanted Myrna Loy, who was an up-and-coming ingenue who had just been given a contract at MGM to play Cleopatra, the treacherous trapeze artist. And she was absolutely horrified by the script, and in her autobiography she recounted how she had to beg Thalberg to let her out of the part. Myrna Loy's replacement in Freaks was not another up-and-coming ingenue and not a major star, but rather an actress who was nearing the end of her Hollywood career. Olga Baklanova was a former member of the Moscow Art Theater who did a number of distinguished silent pictures. She was only in her early 30s when she made Freaks, which doesn't sound old today, but in those days, actresses started very, very young. Many of the leading ladies of the 1920s were barely out of their teens. She had starred in a celebrated mutilation melodrama of the 1920s, The Man Who Laughs. And no doubt Todd Browning was aware of her appearance in it and what a powerful impact she had in it. She did seem to match the description that Todd Robbins had given of his circus performer in his original short story. He described a tall, blonde, Amazon-like woman. And it may have been just very shrewd casting on Browning's part to pick her because the physical disparity between Olga Baklanova and Harry Earls was all that more pronounced than if a petite actress had played the part. And of course there was this profound sexual tension there. The idea of these two people involved in an intimate way was a little disturbing, I think.
It comes by the finest vineyard of France.
And you sent for it specially for me?
For the most beautiful woman in all the world.
Darling.
It's another way very provocative material could get by the censors because it's hidden in plain sight. I mean, they can't even see it. And there's nothing in the production code about relationships between normal-sized people and midgets. And virtually at the time the cameras started rolling, it was announced to the press that Jean Harlow would play the part of Venus, the animal trainer. So instead of Jean Harlow, the part of Venus went to Lila Hyams, who was a very respected actress, but she was not a major star.
You're a funny guy, Frozo. Sometimes you panic me.
Don't I know it? I panic the world because I use my noodles.
Wallace Ford was probably a natural for the part of Frozo. I mean, it's a very American part and full of wisecracks. He specialized in this kind of character. He often played wisecracking reporters. The role of Hercules was originally intended for Victor McLaglen, and this, of course, would have reunited him with Harry Earls from The Unholy Three. But McLaglen was replaced by Henry Victor, who was an actor who had quite a bit of stage experience. He was from Germany, and he also worked on the stage in London before coming to Hollywood.
I'm through wasting my time and money on things like you.
Yeah, your time, but my money.
Ungrateful little tramp.
Freaks is not a dirty word. There's nothing wrong with looking at somebody that is different than you are. And I would defend this to my dying breath. If you walked down the street and you saw a person that was 9 feet tall, you would turn and look at that person. And the reason you turn and look at the person is because they're different. They're unusual.
Well, I think the most important thing about working with the people with physical abnormalities is that underneath it all, they're human beings. And you have to treat them with as much respect as anyone else. And the thing about it is that people from the very beginning to the modern day, and I'm sure on after we're all gone, people will still be interested in that which is unusual, especially people that are unusual.
Well, it's an old concept. I think if we go far enough back, particularly on the European side, the exhibition of freaks, human oddities, or whatever word we all feel comfortable with, is as old as time immemorial.
Life is too difficult to force someone to perform. People do it of their own free will.
I am a professional working little person actor and have been for 12 years now in stage and film and television, commercials. And I think there's definitely a sense of fascination and voyeurism into, and I feel it with other people of difference. I mean, I can't pretend like I'm above being compelled to watch people who are completely different than me.
The essence of all show business, whether it be a famous singer who can hit incredibly high notes, or a beautiful actress who's known for her sexy body, or a person who's 3 feet tall, or someone who's 8 feet tall, or someone who has no limbs or too many limbs. It's all exploitation. There's only one show business, and it's all about selling to the public that which makes you different.
I think exploitation is when, I think you have to be very careful to limit it to the individual. And when the individual feels like they are being used and feels uncomfortable about doing what they're doing, then it's exploitive. I think that society has to be very careful about deciding for others what is harmful to the individual.
Little people should always work because they have to have something to do like everybody else, because it fills up their mind and they get up with a purpose. You know, I have to do this, I have to do that. But it's, they serve their purpose in motion pictures, I'll tell you that, because between the stand-in and the photo double and the stunt work, why, it's quite a bit of work if you're capable of doing what they want.
And there were some people that took advantage of people that were physically different. But that happens all over show business, and I think in every industry. So the interesting thing was that they often made a good living, and it was a decent life.
Number one, they found a way to make a living that they probably thought they would never be able to do because of their deformity. Number two, they were placed in an environment of acceptance from other people that had other physical problems, and they could hold their head up, they could wind up buying a house and all the things that everybody wanted in the quote normal people. So it was a great equalizer.
Browning, of course, was very familiar with sideshows and sideshow headliners and sideshow attractions, and it didn't take long for hundreds of resumes and photographs to be submitted from circuses and sideshows from all over the world.
They had to have assembled more bona fide human oddities and very, very highly respected sideshow acts from that era than anything that's ever happened since.
It was a pretty gutsy thing that Todd Browning made two of the leads of the movie, these little people, Harry and Daisy Earl.
They weren't relegated to bit players. They did lines, and they were very significant to the storyline. Browning's confidence in them must have been quite unique at that point, where he was putting his career on the line, which we all know that he did with the film.
She's the most beautiful big woman I have ever seen. Why, hon, how you talk. I should be jealous pretty soon. Ah, don't be silly.
Harry Earl's real name was Kurt Schneider, and he was a member of a family of little people. They came from Germany to the United States around the time of World War I, and while working at Coney Island, they were billed as the Dancing Dolls, and the name stuck, and they very frequently appeared as the Doll Family.
Harry and Daisy, unbeknownst to many people, had thought they were husband and wife, were actually brother and sister.
There was Harry, his sister Daisy, Tiny, and Grace. Harry, of course, is probably best known to audiences for his appearance in The Wizard of Oz.
He's one of the representatives of the Lollipop Guild, which is one of the most memorable little scenes of the Munchkin Land there.
He was the gentleman on my left, and I'm the one in the middle. He was a wonderful little man. He was the star of Freaks, and I didn't know that at the time, but as I knew him, I learned all about him, and he was quite a character, because don't forget, he was a little over 40, and I was 17 or 18. So it was interesting to hear about his career.
Of all the doll family, Daisy was the tallest, and she was sometimes billed as the Midget Mae West. The dolls lived together in Hollywood, and to make their lives more comfortable, they furnished their home with child-sized furniture and other custom-made trappings that were appropriate for their size.
One of the people that you kind of look at and then do a kind of a double take, I think, is Peter Robinson, also known as Pete Robinson, who was well known in the circus world as a living skeleton, which was a strange tradition that goes back to the days of the dime museums of the 19th century.
Ah, how's the proud father?
Fine.
What was it?
A go.
Better luck next time. You might get a couple of Smith brothers.
I'm fine.
Pete Robinson, the human skeleton, followed in the tradition of a lot of human skeletons in circuses in that he married a fat lady.
He married a woman that was, I think, 462 pounds, Bunny Smith. And just the idea of the living Jack Sprat is, you know, just this wonderful image that people found very entertaining.
And here we have an aspect of sideshows in general that I think is pinpointed better in Freaks than it has been in many other films. It's like communal living.
That there was a sense of community and relying upon each other. The Freaks often married each other.
Peter Robinson and many others like him, Percy Pape, happened to be on the Ringling Sideshow when I was there, but presented the same way, usually working in tight-fitting leotards and a top hat.
And from what I understand, he was also really liked, he was a very political man. He had very strong convictions on things, and that's where you would get in these lengthy discussions with anyone who would listen about, politics.
When Browning had done The Unknown, he was content to use one armless wonder, played by Lon Chaney. But for Freaks, he had two, Martha Morris and Frances O'Connor. And they were both born without arms and learned to do all kinds of incredibly dexterous things with their feet.
Frances O'Connor, when she was working in sideshows, would sit there and she would sign the postcards that she had with her feet, and had better penmanship. I can't call it handwriting, but better penmanship than most of the people that were getting the normal people that were buying the cards.
Neither of them is given a lot of time in the film, but it's really amazing to see how they adapted to their disability.
But you got to remember, they'd been doing that since they were born. This was what was natural to them. And it just goes to show that the Freak Act wasn't just about being gawked at, but they often did something. For instance, Frances O'Connor is a good example of that. She was about 70 years old when she passed on, and worked for many, many years in circuses, did a number of different things in her act. She, as I understand, would talk about her condition, and she loved crocheting, so she would crochet with her feet, which I think is an extraordinary image right there. It's just something she enjoyed doing, and she would just sit there and crochet. And she also did at one time in a sort of a sharpshooting action, a Wild West kind of thing, and that kind of image of sharpshooting with the feet is just an extraordinary thing to behold.
All of the people that I've worked with over the years have known numerous cast members of Freaks, and she particularly, and their commentary was that she was a very well-adjusted person, loved to have fun, and again did quite well for herself, and had a great attitude about herself. And I think that just to go a step beyond her personal attitude, the viewing public today would find it a little difficult perhaps to believe that these people had a good attitude about themselves, but I can assure you they did.
I bet you thought the tent was on fire, huh? Well, it wasn't. Just the Rollo brothers, panicking them again. But then we do it in every town. We're so used to it, it's getting monotonous.
Going back to the 19th century, people who were born with very small craniums, they're called pinheads in the film. The true term is microcephalic, were presented in circuses and sideshows as kind of missing links.
Oh, I'm sorry, monsieur. I am Madame Petralini. These children are in my circus.
People with mental retardation that were in the sideshow go back to the days of P.T. Barnum. One of the first famous one was a man named William Henry Johnson, who was known as Zip, the What Is It? Supposedly because the Prince of Wales visited Barnum and saw this strange person and said, well, what is it? And then he became known as Zip, the What Is It?
Jenny Lee and Elvira Snow had been billed as the last of the Aztec children. And this really goes back to the 19th century when the public was kind of being rocked by the revelations of Darwinian theory.
And the idea of evolution was brought up, and the idea that could be a missing link, that there could be earlier evolutional elements still in our world, was considered an exotic one, and was something that could be exploited and sold.
Of them all, Schlitzie seems to have been the most amiable and actually charmed a lot of the folks on the set.
Schlitzy's real name is Simon Metz. Lived to be about 80 years old and loved being in show business from as far as we could tell, and seemed to really enjoy everything about it.
The first time that I ever worked with Schlitzy was working for an operator named Lou Alters, Colonel Lou Alters. And the situation with Schlitzy and many of the pinheads was that they required a personal attendant, a nurse, if you will. Some of them had incontinence problems and so forth. So there was always someone who, quote, took care of Schlitzy. But Schlitzy had a very wry little sense of humor about him. Schlitzy was a man, by the way, who used to appear dressed as a woman in a sort of a house dress or frock.
I think it's interesting in that the act Schlitzy did was a magic act. Schlitzy would show this bag empty, this magic bag, and then have a guy come up and wave his hand over it, and then Schlitzy would reach in and pull out this oversized pair of boxer shorts and point at the guy and giggle. And the place people would just fall out, just laughing, because Schlitzy was having such a wonderful time performing.
But Schlitzy was quite nice to work with, actually. Very imp or elf-like, that sort of pixie-ish type persona, and it's certainly not hard to understand why that happened, because you're dealing with almost like a precocious child.
And you get that. You so get that in the movie. You just, whenever Schlitzy's on the screen, you just cannot take your eyes off of this little sweet person. There are a couple of unforgettable people in the film. Prince Randian certainly is one of those people.
Even more remarkable than the armless women was Prince Randian, who had neither arms or legs, and yet had a long and very successful career as a sideshow attraction. People born without arms or legs were actually rather common in sideshows and circuses, and were variously referred to in their publicity as living torsos, human caterpillars, human worms.
Let me tell you something that everybody around here don't know. We're only killing time with this circus. We've got bigger time to follow, and we can do it too. Well, catch a rack tomorrow night. We got something new.
Now you can do anything with eyebrows?
When you see him do that little bit of his performance, which unfortunately in the film is cut a little bit short, all you see him is with a cigarette in his mouth, and he does the remarkable thing of taking out the match and lighting it and lighting the cigarette. He also rolled that cigarette.
Despite the handicap, in his case, it was a total handicap, he was able to perform daily functions.
You would think someone like Prince Randian would have a very limited existence. And yet you look at the statistics, that he lived to be 63 years old, and his sort of helper, handler, assistant was his son. Says something right there.
He was married. He had a family. His son was often there to carry him around the sets. And he worked right up to the time of his death. A couple of years after the film, he was performing in a freak show on Times Square, and finished a performance and went back to his dressing room and died. And while we don't know too much about Randian's life, we do know that he was able to, on his own terms, be self-sufficient and gainfully employed. And we may look down our noses at the idea of sideshows, but it's hard to imagine him doing any other kind of productive work. Of all the sideshow performers, the ones we know the most about, because their lives were so well documented, are Daisy and Violet Hilton, the Siamese twins.
The Hilton sisters were probably the best known of the freaks in the film, because they went beyond the carnival and the circus sideshow, and they appeared in vaudeville. They're a well-known vaudeville act. They did a number of things, including playing music. Daisy would play the piano and Violet would play the saxophone.
Mother Nature was very kind to the Hiltons, if kind could possibly be seen as a viable word, because the way they were conjoined allowed them to dance and present themselves in a most entertaining manner, where many of the other unfortunate conjoined twins were joined in such a way that it prohibited much movement.
They were from England originally. They were born in 1908. Out of wedlock, their mother seems to have literally sold them to a couple who immediately put them to work on the carnival circuit. They traveled the world with circuses and carnivals, starting at the age of 3. And they were professionally trained to be musicians.
They then became film entities, and sadly their careers coasted practically back into oblivion when they were pitching items in dime stores towards the end of their career. But they were certainly very talented, very attractive.
And while the Hilton sisters put on very happy faces for the public, what the public didn't know is that they were being treated as virtual slaves by their guardians. Guardian, obviously, isn't even the word for it. And they were finally able to legally emancipate themselves. And after 1931, went on to tour vaudeville themselves, and were really rather successful at it. They commanded large salaries and attracted large audiences.
I mean, money by today's standards, that would be considered extraordinary. And this was the 1920s, the 1930s. And there's just something just remarkable about them, and brings up all kinds of images of the idea of that Todd Browning plays upon, of one being kissed and the other enjoying it. And things like that, that you just wonder, how connected are they? And what was their experience in life romantically?
There's a subplot in Freaks involving the Hilton sisters and their fiancés and their attempt to get married.
Roscoe, this is Mr. Vollger.
Glad to meet you.
Violet and he are engaged to be married.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, and you must come to see us sometime.
Thanks. And you must come to come to see us sometime too.
This really actually reflects something that was going on in their lives. They, largely for publicity reasons, had traveled the country trying to find a state that would issue them a marriage license, and were not able to succeed until 1936. They both were married very briefly, although they were rather sham marriages and kept them in the headlines. But it must have been a heartbreaking thing for them to go through, and of course in Freaks it's treated very, very lightly. There's one anecdote that's been told many times in some different ways about F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was working on some screenplays at MGM at the time, and came into the commissary and encountered the Siamese twins, Daisy and Violet Hilton, and was horrified when he realized that although only one of them was reading the menu, both of them seemed to be understanding it. And he apparently rushed from the commissary sick to his stomach. We don't know if that really happened or not, but we do know that in one of his short stories called Crazy Sundays, he does make a reference to a studio that's shooting a circus picture with sideshow people.
Johnny Eck was definitely everybody's desire as a leading man. Had a wonderful on-camera persona who's quite handsome, very articulate, and I suspect very strongly that if he had moved on into this era, he probably would have had a wonderful career as a news anchor or something of that sort, and nobody would have ever known that he had any physical abnormality. His very, very strong personality. And also talented beyond all this, as a little tack on, that some people are aware of this. He was a marvelous artist.
The smile on his face, the look of him, if you didn't know there was no lower half of the body, you would not think there was anything unusual about the man.
Did you try that gag I told you about?
Yeah, I did, and it was a wow. Get up here, Johnny, and I'll show it to you. I did everything you told me, and I laid him right in the sawdust. Watch this, Venus. Watch this.
Hello, Venus.
Johnny Eck's real name was Johnny Eckhart. He shortened it for professional purposes and was, of course, world famous for being, the astounding half-boy.
What a lot of people don't know is that Johnny Eck had a twin brother. And very briefly, they worked with a magician who wanted to do the ultimate sawing a man in half illusion. And they did this in vaudeville, in that they were going to, the way it was presented is that they were going to bring out this woman and she's going to be sawn in half, and the guy in the audience says, oh, it's just a trick, it's fake. There's no danger whatsoever. And the magician said, come on up on stage. And up on stage would walk Johnny Eck's brother. And they'd say, look at the cabinet there that she's going to be sawn in half, and they'd look and they'd throw him in. And what they would do is they would then switch the full-size brother for Johnny and a dwarf who was in a costume that was just a pair of pants. And you couldn't see the head of the dwarf, it was just the lower half of the body. They would do the sawing, and the box would fall open, and the pants would go running around, and then Johnny would get up and say, hey, where's my lower half going? He would jump, and they'd run around the stage chasing the pants, and just mayhem would ensue.
Only Johnny Eck, of all the performers, seems to have had a pleasant time making the film, and bits and pieces of his autobiographical writing have been published here and there, and he seems to have hit it off rather well with Todd Browning. He claimed that Browning even wanted to develop a follow-up picture showcasing Johnny, but he was the exception rather than the rule.
The great thing about Hollywood of the late 20s and early 1930s is that the special effects were very primitive, and so they had to use their imagination if they wanted to create something unusual. And Johnny Eck had a role, a cameo, in the movie Tarzan Escapes from 1936, in which he plays a Goonie bird, which is this costume that he's wearing, and it's just this strange creature that could only be created with someone who had no or lower half of his body.
Captain Fry!
I only met one of the performers from Freaks very near the end of his life, Angelo Rosito, who, of course, as the character Little Angelo in the film, is the character who dances on the table with the loving cup of wine.
He, like Johnny Eck, became the left-handed darlings of the film industry because producers saw in his ability to deliver lines and such that he was not just limited to his physical deformity. And as a result, he was very sought after. There were many of the variety acts, sideshow variety acts, that also appeared in many early films. Laurel and Hardy, for some reason or other, found a great fascination to that type of act, and they used them extensively.
It's just great to think of his career. I mean, there are many, for lack of a better term, normal actors that didn't have as rewarding a career as Angelo did. I mean, he worked up and just about to his death. He died and he was about 83 years old. He was also an extraordinary person in that he was one of the founders of Little People of America, and worked in just countless films and TV shows, and was just one of the best known little persons in the business, and one of the most versatile.
I was doing some book research in Hollywood and looked up Rosito. He was living in a nursing home, a retirement community, and he invited me up, but decided he didn't want to talk about the subject of Todd Browning or Freaks. And he said he didn't want publicity, and I, assured him I wasn't going to publicize his whereabouts or give his phone number to anyone. But he said, "No, you don't understand. When you look like me, walking down the street's enough publicity." And I thanked him and left.
I remember I think another little friend of mine was in it, little Angelo Rossito. He was one of the stars of Freaks. He was dancing on the table. He was a wonderful little guy.
One of Angelo's last film credits was Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. And just to show you that some things in Hollywood never change, in Freaks he had to suffer the indignity of having the champagne thrown in his face and be called a dirty, slimy freak. And in Mad Max, he was showered with pig excrement. So, yes, it was a living.
We don't know too much about Cuckoo the Bird Girl. She's one of those characters that everyone in the world of sideshow knows of her.
She suffered from a bone disorder and severe vision problems. She was sometimes billed as the blind girl from Mars, and sometimes the bird girl from Mars, or simply the bird girl. And in some of her circus performances, in addition to the feathered costume that we see in Freaks, she sported these huge chicken feet, really quite a grotesque spectacle.
There are photos of her working in Ringling Brothers in the 1920s with Schlitzie, and also another microcephalic, Zip, who worked for Barnum. She worked out in Coney Island for quite a while. And early on in her career, before she found the Bird Girl thing, she was known as Minnie Haha, which is interesting because her real name is Minnie Woolsey.
There are a lot of bird people in this film. Cleopatra is the peacock of the air, and then she's the human duck at the end. We have the bird girl from Mars, and we also have Elizabeth Green, who was sometimes billed as the stork woman or the bird girl. And she apparently was a physically normal woman who just had this goblin-like appearance, very sharp features, and parlayed this into a career in sideshows.
She was really not a freak or a human oddity. She was manufactured. She was just a rather peculiar looking person that one of the sideshow operators decided that he would just embellish her peculiarity and put her in leotards and put a feather on her head. But she, as far as a physical deformity, she was just a little odd.
Many of the people who worked in sideshows had nothing physically wrong with them. The term that's used for somebody who creates a freak out of themselves is a gaffed freak.
She looked like a stork. She was just a strange-looking woman that was apparently that was enough for a career, just to accentuate the whole kind of bird-like quality. Now, I got to tell you, sometimes these people that were not as strange as the others would be used as ballet attractions. And the ballet is that little sales pitch that's done out in front by the outside talker. That's the guy who stands out in front and entices you to buy a ticket. Don't call him a barker. The correct term is outside talker. And they sometimes would have someone like that saying, if you think this is unusual, just wait till you see what's on the inside. So it would give people a little taste, a little show to entice them to buy a ticket and come in and see the show. So it's very possible that she was a ballet attraction.
In many of the sideshows, I would say most, in fact, you had a sex attraction as an extra added attraction in the annex, or as we referred to it, the blow-off, which is the extra show you paid extra money to see. And almost invariably, these people were presented as true hermaphrodites, possessing both the male and female sex on one body. Now, the truth is that there are very few in medical history true hermaphrodites.
Josephine Joseph was a classic hermaphrodite. Today, the term intersexed person is much preferred.
This act is fascinating in that what lengths people would go to be in show business. Because often, and if you take a good look at Josephine Joseph, a good example, and there were dozens and dozens and maybe hundreds of performers like this.
Now, obviously, there were limits to how graphically a hermaphrodite could be presented to the public. And so it was a common convention among these performers to adopt the half-and-half costume, female on one side, male on the other.
But it's a wonderful presentation. And the lengths they would go to is they would often do exercise with free weights to build up the musculature on one side, which often was dressed in sort of a Tarzan loincloth kind of thing, and then would cover up the other side when they'd sit out and tan this side. So this would be very pale and kind of flabby and would kind of push it up so they have a little bit of cleavage on this side and dress in a little frilly dress. And it's a strange tradition. I don't know where it came from, but it's just a wonderfully glorious fraud.
Nice to a lot of mangy freaks.
Aha! Just as they are represented on the banners, you will see them on the inside. Living, breathing monstrosities. Josephine Joseph, half woman, half man.
Have a cigar, Joseph.
You dropped your lipstick, Josephine.
Don't get her sore or he'll bust you in the nose.
A good portion of the people that we're talking about were actually very good female impersonators that did a very convincing job of convincing the mostly male attending audience in the annex that they were indeed part woman, part man.
Olga Roderick, or Madame Olga, as she was often billed, was another one of those performers who lived to regret being involved in Freaks. Her real name was Jane Barnell, and in later years she did give one interview where she said she thought Freaks was an insult to circus performers everywhere and wished she had never appeared in it.
Some of the bearded ladies, certainly not all of them, were female impersonators. Now, there are a good many actual bona fide hirsute women that worked as bearded ladies in sideshows.
She was a very political, she was a socialist and had very strong views on things. And she used to work, towards the end of her career, she worked at Hubert's Museum on 42nd Street. And she was not a terribly friendly, happy woman. And of all the people that worked on this movie, she was the most vocal in her dislike of the whole thing.
As Todd Browning, gets across in this film, offend one and you offend them all. But in the case of making Freaks, Browning found that they all had their own very strong individual egos and personalities and agendas. And apparently Olga Roderick had a particularly oversized impression of herself.
There's the scene where she's giving birth to Peter Robinson's baby. And they kind of make some reference that, little girls look like it's going to have a beard like the mother. And she doesn't look terribly happy about doing this.
Oh, gee. Ain't it cute? What is it?
A girl.
Oh, boy, that's great, and it's going to have a beard.
I don't know if it just comes with the territory of women with beards. It's certainly not the one that I work with, Jennifer Miller.
I was growing my beard long before I worked in the sideshow. And so I always had this image of the bearded lady as kind of, this little icon sitting on my shoulder, battling with me and how I was seen in the world. So when the opportunity came to, when I was sort of invited, enticed to come work in the sideshow, I wanted to give it a try. I wanted to meet this person, this image, this history that I'd been in dialogue with, sort of face to face, the image of this. So I went in and gave it a try, and it was certainly very interesting to be letting myself be called a bearded lady or a woman with a beard. I am okay with the concept that Lady Olga worked in the sideshow. Sure, I mean, certainly she, first of all, lived in a very different time. And I feel a sisterhood with her as well. I mean, she might have been on some level making the same choice I was. The world seems to be treating me well these days. Of course, it's a big world. And so there are, you know, how many encounters in a day in the world are there for me to relate to you? It's still upsetting to some people, this confusion, this gender confusion, which brings up, why am I making this choice? I mean, people ultimately understand this is a choice, right? I mean, you know, they know there are ways to get rid of hair. And so they're wondering, why am I doing that? What's the challenge, and who am I?
Production on Freaks began in October of 1931 and continued for 36 days. And to economize and perhaps to make the studio feel a little better about the kind of film they were doing, and it wasn't going to cost them a huge fortune, recycled some of the sets.
And this was a way of cutting down on costs, and also just made things a lot easier.
A Garbo picture that had recently been finished called Susan Lennox, Her Fall and Rise, which was set in a circus. And some of the circus wagons that were used in The Unknown reappeared. Browning seems to have had a number of problems during the production of Freaks, a lot of interference of one sort or another. He didn't make the transition to talkies very well. And with his silent films, he was really completely in charge of everything, but talkies kind of threw him. He wasn't comfortable, I don't think, directing dialogue.
Sound had come in just a few years before, and the code was coming in that put restrictions on what could be seen. And it was this wonderful moment when almost anything would go, and there was still this desire to see how far you could go with a film. And Todd Browning took it in a direction that no one else had ever done.
His background was not, you know, the legitimate theater. It was vaudeville and slapstick comedy and that sort of thing. And during the silent era, he was able just to keep up a steady stream of instructions to his performers. And he was involved in all aspects of his films. He developed the stories. He was deeply involved in the editing.
These people were taken out of their natural habitat and brought out to Hollywood. And as far as I understand it, it changed a lot of them. They kind of went Hollywood, being out in the sunshine there, and being in the middle of it all, and being driven around and being treated like royalty and wearing sunglasses and having the whole star treatment.
One very funny thing about the film is that while it was supposed to take place in a very small traveling circus in Europe, the sideshow that Browning assembled was actually quite a bit bigger than even the largest sideshows that Ringling Brothers had ever put on. I never before had so many world-class sideshow attractions been put in one place. The film was both previewed and premiered in San Diego in January 1932, and there are a number of stories, and we don't really know if they're true or not. But the most famous one is that a woman ran screaming up the aisles during the film, and it could have been a publicity stunt. We really don't know.
I sometimes wonder what was going through Todd Browning's mind when the film was completed and it was shown to a preview audience, and they were horrified by it. They didn't get it. People were so shocked by what they saw, they actually got up and went, fleeing from the theater, fleeing for their lives, because supposedly the story goes that one woman was so shocked by what she saw on the screen, she had a miscarriage and ended up suing. It sounds like a publicity stunt, but who knows? It's a pretty horrific one if it was all set up.
The country was going through a very, very difficult period in the early Depression, and then as now, people are always looking for scapegoats. Hollywood was a convenient scapegoat for a lot of civic groups and religious groups and women's groups, and there was a growing backlash against the kinds of pictures Hollywood was putting out. Gangster pictures especially, horror movies, and Freaks was a particular lightning rod for these groups. They felt it was a new low in Hollywood depravity, that it was an extremely cruel and exploitative film.
The fate of the film was sort of sealed when it was shown in Los Angeles, February of 1932. The critics hated it. They didn't get it. They were just horrified and just thought it was wrong.
Hollywood could tolerate anything except the loss of money. Browning was able to do the kind of films he wanted all through the silent era. Many of the pictures he did with Lon Chaney received the same kind of criticism, but they made money and the audiences flocked to them. But in this case, MGM knew it had a hot potato on its hands. It was drawing too much attention. In some cities, it actually did fairly good box office. There were some positive reviews. Luella Parsons in Hollywood, who was not easy to please, gave it her seal of approval. But finally, the studio decided the film was just too much of a headache, too much of a public relations problem, and it was withdrawn from circulation after its New York engagement in the summer of 1932. Freaks was banned in parts of the world for over 3 decades. And it wasn't until the 1960s that a new generation rediscovered it in a very, very different context than its original release. It was rediscovered by the art house circuit, and especially by the counterculture.
The real resurrection of the film, more than just a revival, but truly bring it back to life, happened in the 1960s. And it's not surprising because, well, of the social climate. People were looking, after spending a decade of the 1950s, and that this was how you lived, to all of a sudden a decade of, well, why do we have to live like that?
And as the Vietnam situation was heating up, the counterculture embraced the idea of transgression, of freakishness. The word freak took on a whole new meaning. And it was very, very popular on college campuses and at midnight movie screenings. It was also kind of rehabilitated and has continued to be so until this day. And I think it's a point that can be argued. And today, through the distorting lens of political correctness, many people feel that Freaks is a profoundly compassionate film.
Why do we have to feel bad about ourselves if we're outside the norm? And you know, we're gonna call ourselves freaks. We're gonna freak out. We're gonna have a freak in. We're gonna be freaky. And with that embracing of the word, well, sooner or later, the idea that there's this movie out there that embraces the idea of being different and celebrates it would come back to life, and it happened at the Venice Film Festival. And it is that culture of the 1960s that caused Freaks really to come back into the mainstream again.
After Freaks, Todd Browning's career went steadily downhill at MGM. There were a lot of reasons for this. It wasn't just Freaks. He still was uncomfortable with the techniques of talkies. And of course, he had violated one of the central codes of the carnival.
On a bigger scale of things, it's a pretty gutsy film in that Todd Browning rolled the dice, and as we know, looking back on it, the numbers didn't come up for him. It basically put an end to his career because it was too adventurous.
He liked to boast that his salary was larger than that of the President of the United States. And he was able to retire on his living to a house in Beverly Hills and a beach house in Malibu. And there is finally where he moved and spent the rest of his life. But he never gave an interview. He never gave a retrospective interview, and took a lot of his secrets to the grave.
Todd Browning put on film some unforgettable people in an amazing film that it has its shortcomings, and yet it still has so much that is wonderful about it and is worth watching over and over again.
He was a profoundly cynical artist and had a rather despairing concept of the human condition. And Freaks is a disturbing film because it's a very ugly film. And not just because of what's in it, but what we bring to it with our own reactions. And I think it'll always be a very, very controversial film. But one thing is for sure, nothing like it has ever come out of a major studio.
The film Freaks would be worth watching not as a historical commentary on the way movies were made or why they're currently made in a different fashion. It would be seen as pure entertainment. We've already been case-hardened to so much shock and horror that you can no longer see it as a horrifying film. Now you're going to pay attention to the odd juxtaposition of attitudes and jealousy. You're going to see it, in short, as a story. You're going to somewhat be able to lose the deformity of the people, and you're going to find that you can identify with the people. In fact, you'll identify so well with the people in the film that you will start to see a lot of your current surrounding as the real freaks and not those people.
The strength of Freaks is that it elicits such a diversity of response. It's a film that people can argue about endlessly and passionately. People can find it a profoundly human story. Other people find it an inhuman story. But the one thing that nobody will argue is that anyone who's seen Freaks never forgets it.